If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is where we're going to spend our time. Last Wednesday this came up, and I've thought about it a lot, although I have to say I wish I could claim that it was a plan to work on this sermon. The sermon was already in process by Wednesday, so it wasn't a plan. I'm not that smart to plan things. I'm not a good planner, let me put it that way. But we talked about the idea on Wednesday night that the biblical characters many times seem like people that are so far lifted above who we are that it's hard to relate to them. And it is. I mean, I look at somebody like, just take the 4 Hebrew boys in Daniel. 3 of them thrown into the fiery furnace. Those people are just otherworldly to me in their courage. Or Joseph, otherworldly to me in his purity and his devotion to God. There are 2 things going on here in the Bible that I think lend this idea. One of them is time is so compressed in the Bible. I mean, we look at someone like Elijah, this great hero of the faith, and he is. But his ministry was about 25 years or 30, based on the numbers of kings under which he served. And he did 8 miracles. We get the idea that the Bible is just miracles happening all over the place. And that's just not the case. The time spans are different than we imagine. But the paragraphs are stuck together, so in 10 minutes you read about all that Elijah did, and you think, wow, what an incredible life. But it's not like that in real life, and we forget that a lot of times. And what it does is it does 2 things to us. One, it distorts the view we have of the person we're reading about. The other is it distorts our view of who we are and what God is doing through you and me, and what God is using you and me and others like us to do in the world. We've talked about it a little in Sunday school when Ed mentioned the fact of what a beautiful thing it is when we have those insightful moments, when God pours something into us in a moment in time, and we have that huge sense of satisfaction that we get for just a few moments. How many of those are in a lifetime? You can count them on your fingers. I can count the times when God has done something like that in my own life on the fingers of one hand and still have some fingers left over. So what's going on here? In a culture that is driven, like ours is, and always has been the case, to look at people as heroes, what is the proper view? So let's take a look at this text. In 1 Corinthians 10, I'm going to start reading in verse 14. Now, this text may seem somewhat distant to these thoughts, but I would like for you to keep those thoughts, as the preamble gave us to think about, in mind as we go through this text. Verse 14, so then, my dear friends, flee idolatry. I am speaking to thoughtful people, so consider what I say. Is not the cup of blessing that we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread that we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all share the one bread. Look at the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices also partners in the altar? Am I saying that idols or food sacrificed to idols amount to anything? No. I mean that what the pagans sacrifice to idols, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot take part in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or are we trying to provoke God to jealousy here? Are we really stronger than He? Everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds others up. Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other person. Eat anything that is sold in the marketplace without questions of conscience, for the earth and its abundance all belong to the Lord. If an unbeliever invites you to dinner and you want to go, eat whatever is served without asking any questions of conscience. But if someone there says to you, this is from a sacrifice, do not eat, because of the one who told you, and because of conscience. I don't mean your conscience, but the other person's conscience. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I blamed for the food that I give thanks for? So, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Do not give offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone in all things. I do not seek my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that many might be saved. Now, this is a huge text, and I'm going to say, in order to understand this text really well, you need to be very well acquainted with the 2 chapters previous, because this text is kind of the culmination or summing up of those 2 previous chapters, in which Paul goes into great detail about these questions. What does he mean when he says everything's permissible? He means simply that Jesus has summed up the law, has fulfilled it entirely. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, period. Jesus' life, teachings, death, and resurrection fulfill the entirety of the law. Therefore, Paul says, love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So he's referring here to a specific thing, and from it he is drawing what I would call a general principle. The market, take the meat sold in marketplace. That's Paul's specific thing that he points to use to make a general principle. That meat had 3 divisions of use in the ancient world. And he's speaking in Corinth, where there was a temple of Aphrodite, so this was a common thing, that this meat would be sold in the marketplace. The three ways that it was used were this. 1, it was meat that was used in a blood sacrifice in a pagan temple. That's where it was. They sacrificed an animal. They then cooked the animal. And then they consumed it in the pagan temple, but there was always some left over. What did they do with that? They took it to the marketplace and sold it for profit. That's what Paul's speaking of. And that 3rd category, the meat that they sold for profit, is what he's referring to here. Now, Paul has made an equation here to get us to think, wherein he says, 1, the table of the Lord, and 2, the table of demons. And he's telling us straight out that there's no concord there whatsoever. And he's speaking to a very specific group of people. These are Gentile believers in Corinth for the most part. There are some Jews there, no doubt. But for the most part, he's speaking to pagans who have become Christians. And the Greeks had a love for human learning. So when Paul says, you are thoughtful people, in other words, he's holding their own standard against them and saying, you're so smart, you ought to know better. Right? You're so wise, you can figure this out for yourself. You know. I mean, this is incredibly juvenile almost. You know that an idol is nothing in the world. I mean, he's saying, look, if you Corinthians can't figure out that that's just a block of wood up there, or a block of stone, or a block of metal, or a block of something of all 3, it's a block of something that has no power in itself whatsoever. It is nothing. You might as well pray to a tree stump. But there's a connection to something other than just the block of stone or the block of metal or the block of wood, and that is what the pagans sacrificed to the block of wood, they sacrificed to demons. Very, very serious accusation here. And he's saying this is what idolatry is. This is why God was so zealous throughout the history of Israel to say, do not worship idols. An idol is nothing. You go read Isaiah. What does Isaiah say? He's got this long, sarcastic diatribe about the block of wood. He says the carpenter takes it, he saws the tree down, and out of part of the tree he takes part of it and chops it up into bits and cooks his meal, and over another part of it he carves an idol and falls down and worships in front of it. How stupid is that? Right? It's pure sarcasm, but he's making a point. There's a reason that people would fall down in front of that idol, and that's because the idol represents something. It represents a demonic entity that these people are worshiping. There's people who say, oh, isn't that stupid that you go to some tribal location and you say, aren't these people silly that they worship these bones? Yeah, if you look at it from a human perspective, it's silly, but I promise you there's a reality there or they wouldn't be doing it. Stuff happens. Satan is happy to hand out candy to anybody who will go anywhere but the cross. Anywhere. Happy to hand it out. So, don't think for a second that these pagans, even though Paul is saying, look, you're smart people. These are people in the church, so they know better. He's saying, you know who Jesus is, you know who God is, and you know that the block of wood is nothing. However, there's a reality there that you also know is very real for those who fall down in front of these things. And he's making the case here to say, look, the modification of behavior that the Spirit of God brings to you is the evidence for the fact that you are born again. There is no other. Now, before God, God sees it. But who's going to see it outside of that if there's no change in who you are? And this is where maturity becomes, in my view, somewhat distorted for us. I'll never forget when I first became a Christian. Now, these people who I was traveling with, they'd been believers for a long time, since they were in college, and they were in their 30s. And I just thought, well, these are mature believers, and probably they were. But we would travel, and if you got 5 or 6 hours with several other people in a vehicle and you got nothing to do, you're going to talk about stuff. And it was nice in that we talked about things like, how should we think about this as a believer? Well, one of them was, where do you buy your groceries? Now, or where you patronize a business. When I lived in California, there was only one major grocery store that was near me, and it was called Safeway. Now, Safeways aren't everywhere. They're mostly in the West and Midwest. I don't think there are any in the South. Maybe there are. But I remember in the conversation, they were saying you shouldn't patronize a place that you know is a pagan location. I'm thinking, well, I'm a new Christian. I'm believing what they say. I'm thinking, well, that's sensible. But then as I got older, I realized, how do you shop for groceries anywhere? How many Christian grocery stores are there? I don't know. I'm sure there are some. But how many are there not? Right? Safeway is owned by the Mormons. That's who owns Safeway. So should I not eat the apple that I bought at Safeway for sake of conscience there? You see, Paul is a Jew, and he's writing this to pagans who have no scruples about things, but they've become Christians, you see. And they're having the same kinds of conversations that we had in the vehicle. Should we be shopping at Safeway? Safeway's a Mormon store. So from a Jewish perspective, you think about it from Paul's point of view here. You'd go to eat at somebody's house as a Jew. Were the fruits and vegetables that you're eating, were they consecrated before you ate them? Were they tithed properly? Were the condiments and the fruits and everything tithed? Or the 10% set aside over there in the corner? Were the people seated around the table, were they all clean? Jewish, kosher clean? Had the meat been offered to idols? That's a very Jewish question. Had the animal been killed by wild predators? Or had it been put to death in a kosher way? Had it been prepared in a kosher way? I mean, all of these are big questions. And Paul just wipes all of this aside with one statement. Everything belongs to the Lord. The earth and all its provision belongs to the Lord. And so these decisions that are being made about what's clean and what's unclean, what's good, what's bad, should I eat the apple from Safeway? It all belongs to God. All of it. So Paul is saying, we are at liberty here. We're at total liberty here. If something is not prepared in a kosher way, forget about it. Jesus died on the cross. He fulfilled the entirety of the law. There's no more kosher or not kosher. Now, if you want to observe that, fine, but don't hold it over other people to observe it as a matter of conscience. It's your conscience that's the problem. But then he says this, and this just is curious. He says, but let's say you go to the pagan household and somebody sitting there says, you know, Paul, that was sacrificed to an idol before it was bought. Paul says, then you don't eat it. But not because of yourself, but because the person who said that, they're the ones with the problem. And for their sake, you do not eat the meat that was sacrificed to the idol. You see, it's like this. I remember when Terry and I first started playing music together. Now, when I was playing music professionally or semi-professionally, we traveled. I wore stuff that I would never wear in here. In fact, I wouldn't wear it at this age I have reached, period, because it just would look kind of weird. You know, spandex doesn't look good on a 65-year-old guy. But Terry, when we started playing music together, we were playing at banks and places like that, you see, where they'd have a banquet and they'd say, you come do music for us. And Terry would tell me, this is what he did. He took me out one afternoon and we bought some clothes for me to play in because I just didn't care about that kind of stuff. I mean, after all, I came from a time when you played in spandex, or you played in a pair of torn up jeans, or you played in a t-shirt or a tank top or whatever. You're rock and roll. Well, Terry said, no, we're doing things for these professionals. He said, no one will ever be angry with you for being overdressed. And he was right. Well, this is the same thing. No one will be angry. If that person who raises the issue about the meat and says, did you know that was sacrificed to an idol? No one will ever accuse you of being overcautious for the sake of the Lord in that instance. You might not get to eat the barbecue, which is, of course, a loss if you like barbecue, but nevertheless, that person will be blessed by the fact that you were willing to forego something you and I might like in order that their conscience be satisfied. Now, let's say, for instance, let's make another practical example here. You're in your house and you invite some friends over for dinner, and they're Mormons, right? You routinely make pictures and pictures and pictures of iced tea in your home. The Mormons can't drink iced tea because it's a darkened liquid. Their scruples are such that they cannot drink it. They can't drink Coca-Cola or coffee for the same reasons. So would you then throw your chest out and say, well, it's my house? Or would you acquiesce for the sake of their conscience to not serve the iced tea? If we are someone who would throw our chest out and say, oh, it's my house, that says some bad things about our discipleship. Period. Paul says in Galatians, we are each to bear our own load, and one of those loads is the conscience of other people. We all have one to bear, don't we? So it's in the bearing of those loads, you see, that our walk with Jesus becomes defined. Period. Because there's no way that me walking through Walmart, I'm a believer. If I don't interact with somebody in some way that says something about that, they have no idea that I'm a believer. No idea at all. And so here we are in our culture where we worship heroes, right? And you think maybe that's just now. It's always been that way. Always. Even in the times when Jesus was walking the earth, there were gladiators who were the heroes. There were people who ran the chariot races who were heroes. You were a hero until you got killed, and then they needed a new hero, but that's the way that went. But this idea of people being heroes is something we've always lived with. Now, I know this seems distant from the text, but hang with me just a few more minutes and you'll see how it ties. I think it's funny to me that I've always thought, I don't know whether I should laugh at this or be a little frightened of it when I see somebody wearing a jersey with somebody else's name on it. That's just something that's just so weird about that to me. Maybe you like to do that and I'm getting myself in trouble, but I had friends that liked that, and I used to say, why do you want to walk down the street with a football jersey that's got somebody else's name on it like that? Well, it's because those people are seen as some kind of hero. So what does that mean for you and me? You see, what Paul is describing here in this text is the kind of heroism that you find in Christianity. And that goes for every person in this room. Let me give you an example. All of us in this room at some points, many points usually, will bear some load for which we have no notice. Nobody knows it. Nobody knows we're bearing that load. Take, for instance, a friend of mine I got to know because I was introduced to her, Louise Beverly. Louise Beverly had her son Marvin. When I met Marvin, he was already 62 years old. Louise Beverly was 84. She lived in a house out Swanee Chapel Road that was just about, let's hook a chain to it and pull it down and build a new one. Her heat was a iron stove in the middle of the living room. The only really fit piece of furniture in there was Marvin's hospital bed. Marvin could not ever be without full-time care from the time he was born until the time he left the world. She took care of him from the time he was born right through until finally she got to be so infirm that she had to be put in a nursing home herself, and they put her and Marvin in the same room where she continued to take care of Marvin. That's heroic. That's heroic. You won't see her name in the newspaper. You won't see her on TV. Think about this. I have a friend who's an executive in a large company. You know what? He's a Christian. You know what he thinks his job is? To make his employees look good. That's his job. Now, there are all kinds of things you could say, well, it's going to help him out. Sure it will. It'll help him out if his employees look good. But it might cost him too. Office politics can be pretty nasty sometimes. Or you take somebody who's in a relationship that's just unlivable, and they determine to remain in that relationship for the sake of conscience before the Lord. Or you take a person who is supporting someone at a job that is just mind-numbingly tedious and difficult, and they soldier on in that for the entirety of their adult life to care for the people they care about, whom they feel are their responsibility to take care of, their entrustment from God. We could go on endlessly. Take the person who, and we know some of them, who is minding their own business as an 18 or 19-year-old, and they get a draft notice to go fight in a war that they have no skin in the game whatsoever, but they do it. They do it anyway. These are heroic things. And so you and I have the option to decide how these things are going to go for us as believers. Let me just fill you into something here that maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway because I thought about it and I decided I'm going to do that. I'm not good at any of this. Yesterday, I was a pill the entirety of the day. Just a pill. Now, why was I a pill? Because life looked to me like it wasn't going the way I thought I would like for it to go. And so I decided I'm just going to let that all be available for Becky to endure for the entirety of the day. And that's what I did. You know, we either carry the burdens, the entrustments that God has given us, and we carry them because we embrace them, or we carry them bitterly. And we get to pick. We get to pick. We either embrace things to glorify God, or we fight these things under the load that God's given us to bear. Catherine Booth, the wife of William Booth, you may not know who that is. They founded the Salvation Army. She was a little girl. She was 6 years old and with her parents. And this bailiff came out of a police station with a prisoner chained to his wrist and was walking that prisoner to be punished. And Catherine Booth left her parents' handhold and ran up to the prisoner. And of course, their parents were just mortified. What in the world is this little girl doing? But she grabbed the prisoner's hand and walked with him to the punishment. And parents said, "What were you thinking?" She said, "He looked so alone. He needed somebody to be with him too." You know, we're going to be changed by the choices we make all the way through our lives. We will crescendo and we will diminish. We'll crest and fall as followers. But how we choose to respond to God in those places where He entrusts us with something will change our lives one way or the other. Robert D. Vincenzo, you may not know who that is, and I didn't know who that was till I read about him. So he was a golfer in the 50s and 60s who won 230 tournaments. Now, if you know anything about golf, you know that the purses are pretty large. So he was a wealthy man. And after one of the tournaments, a woman came up to him and told him of her sick child at home. And so he just handed her, he endorsed the check for the winnings and handed it to her and said, go and with this, use this to buy your baby some good days. About a week later, the lady finally tracked him down and said, look, I lied to you. I don't have a sick child. My child's fine. You know what Robert D. Vincenzo did? He clapped his hands and said, you mean the baby's not dying after all? That's the best news I've had all week. He's not a pastor. He's not a priest. He's a golfer. There are heroes everywhere that God is calling. Our lives here on this earth are incidental. They are. They're going to come and go. But if we complain about the entrustments God gives us, it's just going to make us bitter and a pill. But if we'll embrace them, it'll cause us to grow. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about